If everybody could find a seat, we'll get started. My name is Barry Loveland, and I'm the chair of the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania History Project. Welcome to our program commemorating the 40th anniversary of the creation of the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities by Governor Milton J. Shapp in 1976. This anniversary is a significant milestone in the LGBT, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender civil rights movement in both Pennsylvania and the nation. But it's just one of many initiatives that Governor Shapp had for LGBT equality, about which you'll hear more later. Now, Governor Shapp was Pennsylvania's 40th governor, its first Jewish governor, and we are calling him America's first LGBT equality governor. Tonight's event is part oral history program, part reunion. We have 8 former members of the council and 1 member of the Shapp administration who helped create the council presenting this evening. Several other former council members are attending in the audience. You'll hear in a few minutes from Mark Segal, who was the first gay person to have a formal meeting with an elected governor of any state, who will share his memories of that meeting and his subsequent working relationship with Governor Shapp and his staff. You'll also hear from Tony Sylvestri, chair of the council throughout its existence, who will provide an overview of the purpose of the council and his thoughts about its accomplishments and legacy. You'll hear from other members of the council and agency representatives who will discuss their roles and share their memories and thoughts about the impact of the council on changing public policy. And finally, you'll hear from activists for LGBT civil rights about the current and future outlook of LGBT public policy in Pennsylvania. After our program concludes here, please join us for a reception and an opening of a new temporary exhibit in the State Museum called We're Here, Pioneering LGBT Rights in Pennsylvania, which will run through October 30th. And that reception and opening is going to be on the 2nd floor, and we'll help direct you up there. In addition, Mark Segal has brought along, or we have copies of his memoir that he recently published, which is available out in the lobby, and I'm sure he will be signing copies for anyone who would like that. So at this time, I'd like to introduce James Vaughn. Jim has served as executive director of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission since November of 2011. His more than 30 years of experience in the museum field includes vice president, stewardship of historic sites for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and executive director of several historical organizations, including the Hermitage, home of President Andrew Jackson in Tennessee, the San Diego Historical Society, and Strawberry Bank in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He holds both a bachelor's and master's degree from Ohio State University and has won numerous awards for his work. Yep.
Good evening, and welcome. Take a little sip of water here. PHMC and the State Museum of Pennsylvania are really delighted to host this event this evening as we celebrate together the 40th anniversary of the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities. I think tonight you're going to hear a lot of great stories about events that shaped the LGBT community over the past 40 years. 40 years sounds like a long time, but as I suspect many of you know, 40 years goes by in a flash. I began my career in museums and in preservation just about 40 years ago, and I can tell you it went by in a flash. But during that time, the LGBT community was a welcome and important contributor to the nation's museum community. In fact, one could almost say that America might not have a museum community or a preservation community if it were not for the LGBT community. On a personal note, many members of that community have helped me in my career, have served as mentors and teachers at important moments for me, and have been lifelong personal and professional friends. So it means a lot to me personally to host this event here as well as professionally, and I simply want to wish you a great, enjoyable, and learning evening. Barry?
Dr. Rachel Levine is Physician General for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Professor of Pediatrics and Psychiatry at the Penn State College of Medicine. Her previous posts include Vice Chair for Clinical Affairs for the Department of Pediatrics and Chief of Division of Adolescent Medicine and Eating Disorders at the Penn State Hershey Children's Hospital, Milton S. Hershey Medical Center. Dr. Levine is a graduate of Harvard University and the Tulane University School of Medicine. Dr. Levine.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here. So thank you, Barry Loveland from the LGBT Center History Project, and Mr. Vaughn, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. I am very pleased to be here on behalf of my boss, Governor Wolf, to welcome you to the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Pennsylvania Council of Sexual Minorities and the opening of this exhibit. So everyone's been talking about 40 years. So 40 years ago, you had mentioned that my college. I was a freshman in college, and I can guarantee you that I never, in my wildest imagination, would have thought that I would have this position, especially as an openly transgender woman. So that would have very much surprised me if you had talked to me when I was 18. So much has changed in 40 years. In fact, so much has changed in the last couple of years. So in Pennsylvania, you can now marry the person that you love, and that is absolutely fantastic. However, we still have a lot of work to do, but all of the positive changes are as a result of very hard work by many of you in the room, Mark Segal and Tony Sylvestri, and my close friend Ted Martin. So applause to all of their efforts. But we're not there yet. Because you can marry the person that you love, and then you can get fired the next day for having done that. So there is more work to do, and then we still have continuing pressures throughout this country. Recent laws in North Carolina and Mississippi and other threatened, very regressive laws in Tennessee and other places. So clearly there is more work to do. Now, my boss, Governor Wolf, is the most supportive person you will ever meet in terms of LGBT rights, equality, and non-discrimination. And I was absolutely thrilled with many of you here to be with him last week when he signed 2 executive orders. The first order was for non-discrimination for state employees, including for sexual and gender minorities. And the second, which includes other people, was for anyone that contracts with the state, to have non-discrimination for LGBTQ individuals. So thank you, Governor Wolf. But we're not done, because what we need is for the Pennsylvania General Assembly to pass broad non-discrimination legislation that includes sexual and gender minorities and place it on Governor Wolf's desk to sign. And so I call with Governor Wolf for the legislature to do that all people in the Commonwealth would be free to be who they are, to love who they want, to marry who they want, and to be themselves, and not to be discriminated in terms of work, in terms of housing, in terms of public accommodations, because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So let's all support all of the hard work from all of you and Governor Wolf to get that legislation passed. Thank you.
Maybe we'll have to call Governor Wolf the second LGBT equality governor in Pennsylvania. Louis Marvin is the executive director of the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania, which provides educational, cultural, and community activities for the LGBT community and allies. Under his leadership, the organization opened a facility in Harrisburg and expanded programs and services throughout its multi-county region. Louis.
Thank you, Barry. And thanks so much to Jim and the rest of our hosts at PHMC for partnering with us on this program and exhibit. And thanks to Barry and the rest of the LGBT History Project Steering Committee for creating programming like this in our region. Barry shared a little bit about what the steering committee and a team of volunteers has accomplished, but I want to emphasize how lucky we are to have their vision and dedication in preserving Central Pennsylvania's LGBT histories and getting those histories out into the community so we can learn about and celebrate them. If you're on the LGBT History Project Steering Committee or if you volunteered in any way for the project, could you stand up quickly? Thank you. One of the most inspiring things that I've learned about our local LGBT history through this project is that we have documentation of minutes from a meeting of an early LGBT organization in rural central Pennsylvania, and that meeting took place in April 1969, which was 2 months before Stonewall. As someone working in the LGBT communities in 2016, outside of a large urban hub, this record is a reminder to me and the people who use the center that our community is everywhere. And that there are role models in our history who advanced LGBT progress by creating the networks that still impact our efforts today. We are here indeed. It's also inspiring as a Pennsylvanian to know that our state was the first in the US to have a governmental body devoted to LGBT civil rights and public policy advocacy, which is what we had in the Governor's Council for Sexual Minorities. Our language has certainly evolved beyond the language of sexual minorities, but it's efforts such as the council that created an environment wherein LGBT people could do more talking about our stories and work out in community how we'd like to shape the narratives of our diverse, dynamic existence. And these efforts to continually shape these narratives about the LGBT communities continue today. I think about the youth of Common Roads, which is the center's youth program. And they are continuing this work of figuring out who they are and negotiating how to talk about their identities and experiences, individually and collectively. And thankfully, along with the rest of us, they have access to this history through programs like this. Thanks for being here, and to our panelists, I look forward to hearing your memories of the council and your insight about the efforts needed to keep moving forward on LGBT equality in Pennsylvania. Thanks.
Ted Martin is the executive director of Equality Pennsylvania, the state's LGBT political advocacy organization. A longtime LGBT activist, he started his career as a legislative assistant and deputy chief of staff of a subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives, and has worked in the fields of architectural preservation, communications, and marketing, and serves on the boards of several nonprofit organizations. In 2011, Martin was named a Person of the Year by the Philadelphia Gay News.
Good evening. When I was first approached to participate in this evening and then invited to speak, I quickly accepted with a sharp quip that I could probably deliver these remarks suspended from the ceiling by my heels. It wasn't meant to be arrogant or as a dare or an invitation or even a hint at how I prefer to deliver public remarks. But there it was, a simple recognition that, like many people before me, I would be talking publicly again about the value of treating LGBT Pennsylvanians fairly, regardless of who they are or who they love. And while I knew that non-discrimination legislation would still be being batted around by legislators and pundits right next door in the Capitol, it is more than fitting that tonight we recognize the bravery of one governor 4 decades ago in the glow of the leadership of another just 4 days ago. Governors Milton Schaap and Tom Wolf both knew the right thing to do, and for that I am grateful. Governor Milton Schaap was the first governor to use an executive order to extend workplace protections to state employees based on sexual orientation in 1976. Each successive governor has issued a similar order to protect state employees based off of sexual orientation, and Governor Ed Rendell added gender identity and expression to the order when he reissued it back in 2003. Right now, Pennsylvania has over 73,000 state employees that will be protected by the order. Governor Wolf is the first governor in Pennsylvania history to prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression for employees under state contract via executive order. The order will impact more than 3,525 state contracts and 9,000 agency grantees for the first time in history. This order will prohibit discrimination by reason of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression in hiring practice, as well as the award, selection, or performance of any contract or grant issued by Commonwealth agencies. Of approximately 270,000 LGBT Pennsylvanians in the Commonwealth's workforce, 32% are protected from discrimination in their workplaces, homes, and business services. These orders will only slightly increase the number of LGBT people protected in the workplace and create access for LGBT-owned businesses. Governor Wolf's executive orders are important steps in banning some discrimination in the workplace, and more LGBT Pennsylvanians are safer from discrimination than last week. But as we all know, LGBT Pennsylvanians still face discrimination in private industry, in housing, and business services. Pennsylvania remains the only state in the Northeast where it is still legal to fire an LGBT person, evict them from their home, or deny them a business service. The place where American liberty began still remains woefully behind the times, unaware or uninterested in recent polling that shows over 78% of Pennsylvanians support non-discrimination legislation. I also believe that this percentage closely mirrors the level of support amongst legislators themselves. But we will never know unless the leadership agrees to move the bill. It is time for us to move beyond partisanship and recognize that this is a serious issue that affects the good people of our state. In this time when legislators are intensely divided along partisan lines on other issues, this is an opportunity to show that when it counts, we can work together across our differences on issues that affect us all. Non-discrimination is an issue tailor-made for common ground, common decency, and common sense. When corporations as all-American as Disney and as Pennsylvanian as Hershey and Campbell's Soup can not only recognize but embrace their LGBT customers in a sense of fairness and good business, then a state like Pennsylvania, in constant search for growth and expansion, better jump on board before another 4 decades pass and our leadership is caught looking nervously at their feet with little more than excuses to fill the void in conversation. If anything, the executive orders of last week and the celebration of tonight underscore the need for comprehensive, non-discrimination legislation like never before. And we will continue to strongly encourage the legislature to act on the Pennsylvania Fairness Act and put it onto the governor's desk for his signature. And that is a victory celebration that I know we all want. Thank you very much.
Mark Segal is an original member of the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities and is the founder and publisher of the Philadelphia Gay News, which is also celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. He's been an LGBT activist since participating in the riots after the Stonewall Bar Raid in New York City in 1969, and in many political zaps, actions, and demonstrations with his gay raiders. He's had a significant impact on the LGBT movement, particularly in the areas of journalism, equal rights, youth programs, elder housing, and philanthropy. He was recently inducted into the National Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association Hall of Fame. His memoir, And Then I Danced, has just been published, and copies will be available after the program this evening. Please welcome Mark Segal.
Good evening. Okay, I always do this, so let me do it again. How many of my gay brothers are in the audience? How many of my lesbian sisters are in the audience? Where's my bis and my trans? And our allies. Welcome, everybody, and good evening. Barry, Louie, the museum and Central Pennsylvania Historical Society and the Gay Center, thank you very much for hosting this evening. Tonight really is about, for me anyway, honoring my friend, Governor Milton Schaap, and what I consider the first political gay ally that this community ever had nationally. Now, you might be surprised to know this, but our council came about due to Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was, at that point, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, and one night I disrupted the newscast and became America's first gay television star. 60 million Americans saw me when I got between the camera and Walter and held a sign up saying, "Gays protest CBS prejudice." So in 1973, between 73 and 75, the Gay Raiders were probably the most well-known gay activist group in the nation. For those historians in the audience here, or those people who study LGBT history, please look up clippings 73 to 75. Now that's sort of amazing when you consider LGBT history, which most people today don't seem to know. LGBT history in the United States of America started in 1925. I know most of you are probably shaking your head right now. Henry Gerber chartered the first organization in Chicago, Illinois, in 1925. From 1925 until 1969, there were not more than 100 out activists in the nation. 100. And that includes the marches in Philadelphia that took place every July 4th, 1965 to 1969. Now, if you want to do the math really quickly here, figure out how many activists in each city, the major cities in America. One incorporated Daughters of Bilitis, Mattachine Society, and they were only in the top 10 cities in America. Pretty amazing, isn't it? 5 years later, Governor Schaap gets a letter, actually 4 years later, from me. Here's a copy of it. Jason Landau found this in the state archives last year, and to my knowledge, this was lost a long time ago. This is the proposal to create the Governor's Council for Sexual Minorities, and it's dated September 11th, 1973. And then, I got no reply to that letter. But on a strange morning in 1974 at home, I get a call from the governor's secretary. It said, "The governor would like to meet you tomorrow morning in Norristown." This is my book, which has a lot of those details in it. Here's the picture of that first meeting. This is a historic photo for one very good reason. It is the first time that any governor anywhere in the United States of America is photographed with a gay activist. Governor Schaap not only met with us, he did it in public. He called a press conference after the meeting. So when we went into the meeting, he looks at me and says, "You know, I caught your show on the Walter Cronkite show." And he smiled. And he said, "Now, what can I do to help?" That was amazing. It was absolutely mind-blowing. I was there with Harry Langhorne, who was my cohort with all the activities we were working on. And we said, well, you can issue some type of order. We didn't know executive orders existed at that point, to stop discrimination on the state level. We've done something similar in Philadelphia. And then you can create a council to see what the problems of gay people are and handle it that way. He looked at us and he said, we'll see what we could do. And we left the meeting, and as soon as we left, he said, well, wait a minute, there's some press outside. Why don't we have our photographs taken? That was amazing for its time. Remember, this is only 4 years after Stonewall and after the point when there were only 100 gay activists in America. It's spellbinding. So we did that. And the next thing I remember is getting a call from Terry Delmoth and Barry Kahn and several people from the governor's office saying, well, the governor said we're going to create this council. We're not quite sure what we're going to do. And they started, being the bureaucrats that they were, to create this council. And I remember someone up here a few minutes ago was talking about language. Louis, you were, I think, and what we were going to call the council. The name of the council comes directly from the governor himself. He wanted the word minorities in there. That was his choice to use the word minorities. And his reason for that was very simple. He wanted people to realize that the LGBT community, then called the gay and lesbian community, were minorities, and that we deserve the same rights as other minorities. That was really important to him. So, 1975, he issues his executive order, which says there can't be discrimination against LGBT people in the departments which he controls, similar to one that Wolf issued last week. So that was in 1975. So the first thing that happens is that the state police colonel, Colonel Barger, barges into his office and says, I'm not going to have homosexual state troopers. And he bangs his hand on the governor's desk and walks out. The following morning at 6 a.m., I receive a telephone call. It is from Lieutenant Governor Ernie Klein. I pick up the phone, and he says, Mark? I said, yes, Governor. He says, the governor wants you to sign up, become a state trooper this morning at 9 a.m. I said, but Governor, he says, Belmont Barracks, 9 o'clock, hangs up the phone. So I get myself prepared. I have no idea what this is all about. So I get myself dressed. I head over to the Belmont Barracks in Philadelphia, and I get there, and there is a full statewide press corps all waiting. So I had a joke with the Philadelphia press corps at that point, whereby when there was a new reporter, I would always let them ask the first question, and I would answer with a strange answer, and everybody would laugh. Then we would get into the regular press conference. So that morning, there was a new reporter there. Her name was Jessica Savitz. So her first question to me was, and the rest of us was, Mark Segal, you're a homosexual, and you want to be a state trooper? Why? So I said, thank you for telling me I'm a homosexual, and I like men in uniform. Once all the laughter had died down, we talked about the seriousness of the issue. The issue was very simple. If we could do the job, we should have the same right to have the job. Plain and simple as that. And then, of course, I went in to sign up to become a state trooper. This was all street theater at its greatest. You must realize that at that time, I had a full head of hair, and it was down to my shoulders. I was wearing a T-shirt with a peace sign on it, and I had jeans on. And I was signing up to be a state trooper. 1976 was a big year for us, me as well. I published the first copy of the Philadelphia Gay News. We were a monthly at that point. And in our second monthly issue, our cover boy was Governor Milton Schaap. And that became the first interview with any governor in America in LGBT media. Again, he did the first interview ever done. He issued the first executive order. He created the first governmental council in the world to look at the issues pertaining to LGBT people in his state. If that were all not enough, Governor Schaap decided to run for president. Schaap for president begins. And of course, I had to sign up. Schaap, by this point, was my dear friend. Only one thing happened from that campaign. Number one, it was disastrous. It was unbelievable. But we ran in the Florida primary, and I went to Florida to help out a little. And in the Florida primary, two things happened. First, there was a debate. And at that debate, I got to meet a peanut farmer by the name of Jimmy Carter. So the Governor's Council for Sexual Minorities and Governor Shapp had an influence on Jimmy Carter. And as you might recall, Jimmy Carter was the first one to have an LGBT liaison, Midge Costanza. And it came from, again, Governor Shapp. So if all of this is not enough, let me tell you my favorite story of my friend Milton Shapp. So after he's no longer governor, we held a little reception for him in Philadelphia to thank him for everything he'd done. And at the end of that evening, I walked outside with him, and even then I called him governor. And I grabbed him by the shoulders and I said, Governor, why did you put yourself through everything you had done? And he looked at me and he said, Mark, you know, I too am in the closet. And he started to laugh. I was looking strangely at him. I said, what? And he said, my real name is Shapiro. He said, I understand discrimination. So I want to close with reading something to you, a column that I wrote about 2 years ago. If you've read this column long enough, you know that the author, yours truly, doesn't shock easily. But when I do, it's usually an eye-opener. Now, before I go any further, I guess I should say I have ulterior motives for this column. Over the years, there's been way too many interviews requests, but let me tell you about one very special request that I just had to respect. It's not usual for me to get calls or emails from students who are doing reports or papers on LGBT issues and who want to quote or interview. Most time, it's a pleasure to talk with them, and those interactions have just become commonplace over the years. Here's the exception. The phone rings, and the earpiece is at my ear when I hear a young girl's voice say, my father suggested I call you regarding a report on gay rights I'm doing for my school term paper. My questions are the usual. What school, what question, what part of LGBT history are you interested in? And that's when it changed. She said, quote, I'm not calling you about your activism. I'm calling you since I understand that my grandfather was involved with gay rights movement, and my father told me you worked with him. She then said, my father's name is Richard Shapp. And hearing that brought chills. Her grandfather was Governor Milton Shapp. Richard was his son, and now his granddaughter, Rachel, was asking what he did. She had no idea. And unfortunately, most Americans don't. And believe me, he's one of the most important figures in the early gay rights movement. He was a pioneer. At a time when no one higher in government than a mayor would meet with gay activists, Governor Shapp in 1973 became the first governor in the nation to do so. That meeting led to the launch of the first official governmental body to look into the problems faced by the gay community, and the governor ordered all state departments to participate in that effort. This was the first, not just for Pennsylvania, not just for the nation, but the first such official governmental body of its type in world history. Never before had a government offered to create an official panel to look into ways to better serve its LGBT citizens. It was called the Governor's Council on Sexual Minorities, and it became the model for the world. In 1975, Governor Shapp issued the first state executive order to end anti-gay discrimination in state government. Again, something never done before. The following year, he issued the state's first official gay pride resolution. And when he went on Don Quixote's mission of running for president that year, he had the first official presidential gay campaign outreach, Gays for Shapp. While he only won one precinct in the Florida primary, Coconut Grove, then the gay ghetto in Miami, I see most know that, his campaign did lead another candidate to look into gay rights, some peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. His name was Jimmy Carter. And then he appointed the first president liaison to the gay community. Shapp was also my political mentor. We became close friends. My memoirs of him are many, and some outrageous. Once he asked me to become a state trooper, and I had to fight with a colonel, and that colonel gave in, and now members of the gay community can become state troopers. I told you there was a reason I wrote this column. It was because most of the time when I ask students to send me their paper, they never do. Rachel did. Rachel now lives in New England and knows her grandfather was an LGBT pioneer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much. I wanted to mention, too, that photograph he showed in the book is upstairs in the exhibit, so you can get a better, closer look at it, too. Dr. Tony Sylvestri is Professor of Infectious Diseases and Microbiology at the Graduate School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the principal investigator of the CDC and state-funded HIV prevention and care program, co-investigator of the NIH-funded Pitt Men's Study, founder and co-director of the Center of LGBT Research and Wellness, and director of the Center for Mindfulness and Conscious Studies. He's a busy guy. He was chair of the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities during its entire existence. Please welcome Dr. Sylvestri.
I'm a little conflicted. As a social worker, I like people to sit in a circle. But in public health, we show PowerPoint, so bear with me. Milton Schaap. He's a pretty remarkable man. As a young kid, he drove a coal truck here in Pennsylvania. Became a captain in the U.S. Army, got a BA in electrical engineering, and with $500 from the GI Bill, he started Girard Electronics. He was a pioneer in the cable industry. He started that company with 2 employees. He sold the company years later for $50 million with 2,100 employees. So the man was quite an achiever and quite a doer. But he didn't limit himself to economic advancement or his own interest in electrical engineering. He also was a pioneer in terms of his workforce. The AFL-CIO named him Man of the Year because of his employment policies. The Philadelphia Bulletin described his workforce as a little United Nations. When he became governor, he did so in the face of a hostile Democratic Party. Okay, he wasn't the person, that wasn't the first choice of the Democratic Party, but that didn't stop him. He did many, many things, big things and little things. You can thank him for the fact that there are no longer paid toilets on the turnpike. As, you know, every time I travel from here to Pittsburgh, I always remember that. But he did other things too, almost as big. The Sunshine Law in Pennsylvania, Milton Schaap. Established the Department of Aging in Pennsylvania, Milton Schaap. Established the Women's Commission in Pennsylvania, Milton Schaap. Reformed, incredible reform of the insurance industry, Milton Schaap. And created the state lottery, which many of us people as we get older are happier and happier about. But we're here tonight to talk about his executive orders. His first order was a landmark executive order, and it was crafted by our friend Terry Delmuth, who's here, and by the late Barry Cohn, who passed away a few years ago. And that order was limited because he couldn't require the state legislature, certainly, to go along with him, But as executive, he used the power of that office. And what he did was he said, no discrimination in anything that I have jurisdiction over. No discrimination based on sexual orientation in employment, housing, credit, contracting, and provision of service. Immediately after signing that order, he began to receive bills from senators and members of the House calling for legislation to discriminate, to make it lawful to fire gay teachers, to make it lawful to discriminate in employment. And this was a battle the governor faced and dealt with for years during his administration. But he not only issued that order, he established a governmental body. To create the Council for Sexual Minorities. And to my knowledge, this is the first governmental body ever established in the state, certainly, probably in the country, in the world, and I'll argue until I hear differently that in the universe as well. Okay? I mean, this guy was ahead of his time. He established that group. He asked each cabinet member to appoint members from their agencies to represent that council and to work in harmony with it in order to carry out those activities that I just described. And the council had many accomplishments, and we don't have time to go through them all, but I thought I would just highlight a few of them. The council worked with many friends in Pennsylvania in the great case, Dawn Delight versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which was a lawsuit raised by Dawn Delight and the ACLU challenging the state sodomy law. And that case was successful. The governor worked very hard to support the activities of the Attorney General's office as well as others to change that law and to get it struck down by the Supreme Court. In addition, we were faced at those years with the coming of AIDS, and it was the governor and his cabinet members, but the governor and very often the members of our council who represented agencies who were then given the responsibility to write AIDS policies. And those policies were written, some of them during the Thornburg administration, and many of those policies were actually crafted by people in the audience here. Policies in welfare, health, corrections, and education. And I see Art DePratt here from the office of the governor's office who mandated with the governor's office the training for every state employee around AIDS and HIV. And the policies were incredibly effective and incredibly powerful. Carol Rank, who's here, can speak to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Program, a program that still is held up as a national model that provides drugs, very needed drugs, to people with HIV in the state. So it was Schaap's executive order and the people who he brought forward in his administration who began to take leadership in coming up with sane policies on AIDS. There wasn't much funding back there. Thornburg's total budget for AIDS was $150,000. Casey doubled it to a whopping figure of $300,000. But it was, the momentum began to build, budgets started to appear. The Pharmaceutical Benefits Program in particular was very successful in getting enough funds to support their work. Some of the other accomplishments of the council were activity by the council and by the various agencies to do work individually with people who were discriminated against. So there was a professor at Penn State who was fired on charges of moral turpitude, and it was the work of the Governor's Council that had him reinstated. The Governor's Council worked very hard to make sure that people could have an easy time changing name. Trans people going through any of the agencies in Pennsylvania would be able to do that with minimal problems, at least as minimal as they could be made. But most important, in my view, was the work of the council in dealing with services. And as Barry mentioned, I do a lot of work in health research, and what we know is that there is a lingering problems regarding LGBT health. Many disparities still exist around LGBT health in the state. So let's look at services for a minute. If we look at some of the areas, these are just some I've just picked up: children and youth services, health services. These are all agencies in state government. And in each one of these agencies, we can make a link between the agency and what it does and health disparities with LGBT people. And to me, this is the unfinished agenda that I referenced in my title. We have yet to accomplish Governor Schaap's goals of making services in Pennsylvania available to all LGBT people. Now, I don't have to, I think, prove that point. I think you in the audience who are LGBT members or your friends and allies will know what I'm talking about. You know, how confident are we that all of the police systems in our state are culturally competent to deal with LGBT people? How confident are we that all of the senior citizens facilities in the state are competent to deal with LGBT people? When I reached my 65th birthday a number of years ago, I started getting invitations by every senior citizens healthcare facility asking me to come to dinner to decide if I would want to move into their institution. And I always tossed them, and then I just got tired of getting them, so I started to respond and asked them if they were able to accommodate my husband, Michael, and me at the same time. And the mail stopped. I haven't gotten one. It's the truth. I haven't gotten one. And why? Because I suspect that many of our senior facilities are not ready for the barrage of LGBT people who will start hitting their institutions, especially people with HIV who start entering nursing homes. It's going to be a giant challenge for those nursing homes to respond. But the issues go on even beyond that. How many residential drug treatment programs can house trans people successfully in Pennsylvania? If I asked you to find me one, well, I'll ask you to. If anyone knows of one, please let me know, because it's an issue that comes up over and over again. How many LGBT kids in foster care, in group homes, in juvenile detention facilities are safe? How many of them are safe in our school system? These are the services that Governor Schaap told us were services where there should be no discrimination in service provision. The issue is a big one if we look at the money. Billions of dollars available just in 3 agencies there: health, aging, and human services. How many of these dollars are spent in programs that are open to LGBT people fully by staff people who are themselves competent to serve the needs of that population? So, what needs to happen? I had read an editorial in a national gay publication a couple of years ago, and the publisher was arguing that the LGBT movement was over, you know. And I guess he was basing it on the fact that sodomy laws were gone, perhaps basing it on the fact that there's been an increase, even though not in our state, but an increase in state and city ordinances against discrimination for LGBT people. And certainly with the right to marry, he was feeling that our goals were reached. And maybe they were, you know, for the white middle class professionals. But they're not reached for many other members in our community. Gay youth are still on the streets, often victimized, often ejected from their home. Our trans youth and adults are still being murdered in record numbers, unfortunately. old gay men living in nursing homes have to hide their identity for fear of discrimination and even abuse, not only by the agency staff, but also by other people living in the home. Our African American lesbians are still at the bottom of the list in terms of their record underservice, the record of being underserved in basic health care by insurance. My outline is a pretty simple one. What we need to do is gather better data about the service needs of LGBTI people. We need to develop in every state agency work plans to be sure that we have specific plans, make specific efforts to educate the workforce. And we need systems in place to monitor and evaluate all these issues. I think Governor Schaap's agenda remains a challenge to us. I think what he's held out to us is the opportunity and the challenge to ensure that every state program, every county program serves the needs of the entire LGBTI population. Not only the middle class, not only the privileged, but the poor, the kids, the underserved. And I think he also holds out to us a challenge to support people in the bureaucracy today who could make that happen, but who need the support of state government, who need the support of the community, and who need to be protected themselves in order to carry out their work. I think when these things happen, Governor Schaap's goals will be met, and I think finally we will be moving to a new era when LGBT people in need, the underrepresented and the underserved, finally have their day where they can hold up their heads and say, yes, I'm a citizen of Pennsylvania, I'm getting all of the rights and services I deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. At this time, I'd like to have the panelists come up, who are the former members of the council and also the administration, Schaap administration representatives. I'm going to do some brief introductions of everybody. If you could raise your hand to let people know which one of you is who here. Terry Delmuth was Special Assistant for Human Services to Governor Schaap from 1971 to 76. He served as Chief of Staff and Deputy Secretary in the Pennsylvania Department of Education under Governor Casey from 1987 to 94. He also served as Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the Superintendent of Philadelphia Schools from 1994 to 2000. Sam Deetz came out in 1975 and is the founder of the Susquehanna Valley Gays United, which was based in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and is a founding member of the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus. He organized the first LGBT Lobby Day in Pennsylvania, which was held March 23rd, 1976, and was appointed to the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities. He has been active in several LGBT and women's rights organizations and the Democratic Party. In 2013, he married his partner of 37 years. Marilyn Hewitt became involved with gay rights in the early 1970s, serving as the director of the Gay Switchboard in Harrisburg for several years. She served on the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities from 1976 to 78 as a representative from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources. She also worked to encourage the state employees union, AFSCME, to negotiate a non-discrimination clause in their contract. Art Duprat served in the Governor's Office of Administration in Equal Opportunity and in policy writing during the Schaap administration, In September of 1978, Art authored a revision of the Executive Order 1975-5, Commitment Toward Equal Rights, which expanded the powers of the Council for Sexual Minorities. Later, he became Director of Human Resource Management and Planning in the Governor's Office of Administration during the Ridge and Rendell administrations, and implemented a comprehensive AIDS education and training program for all state employees. Carol Rank is a former employee in the Department of Public Welfare, now the Department of Human Services, and was responsible for health-related agency-wide public policy that included creating the department's HIV/AIDS policy, which was the first in the nation and adopted before the Department of Health had a policy, a bureau, or Ryan White funds. Ms. Rank was also the HIV/AIDS coordinator for the department in addition to other duties. Dolly Schuster was an assistant general counsel and later chief counsel of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, a deputy attorney general, Office of Civil Litigation, assistant attorney general, Pennsylvania Department of Health, and assistant general counsel, Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. While there, she served as its representative on the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities, chairing the Government Employees Committee. Currently in private practice, Ms. Schuster graduated from Villanova Law School. I'm sure she's happy today, and was admitted to the Pennsylvania Bar in 1974. Jay Snyder, a Vietnam combat veteran, was the representative on the council from the Welfare Department, where he was assistant to Deputy Secretary for Social Services. He went on to serve in various positions in the Governor's Office, the Department of Community Affairs, the Attorney General's Office, the House Majority Leader's staff, and finally as Executive Director of the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation in the Department of Labor and Industry. And this is the most interesting part of any of these that I've read so far. His avocation was a professional tennis umpire, which took him to 3 Olympics, the US Open, Wimbledon, the French and Australian Opens, and many other tournaments. He became National Director of Tennis Officiating in 1990 and Director of the US Open in 1993. Very interesting. I want to start the panel off with Terry Delmuth, because Terry was, I guess, probably the person who first got Governor Schaap's ear about this issue and had some responsibility in pulling together the beginnings of the council, of what would become the council, which was really a task force of LGBT community people and agency representatives that started a series of meetings over a fairly lengthy amount of time before the council was actually officially created. So Terry, maybe you could talk a little bit about your recollections of the early time of when that all started and what can you share about that?
I actually remembered a lot of things from listening to Tony and Mark and talk, because 40 years is a long time ago. There's a lot of things I don't remember about it, but Barry had asked me to sort of mention 2 things: what my impressions were of the governor, where he came from in terms of his attitude towards things, and what kind of discussions did we have around the council meetings, preparing for the council meetings, what happened after the council meetings, and impressions like that. I can be very brief on the latter because for several reasons. One, as Mark and I were talking about earlier, just about the time when we surfaced to the public the council, I think it was February of '76, as Mark mentioned, Governor decided in the latter parts of '75 to run for president. And it wasn't until he finished behind no ideas, or whatever that term is, in the polls in Florida, they decided to drop out of the race. So for about 3 or 4 months, we just didn't see much of him. And that was during this whole period as we were setting up the beginning of the council. So we didn't talk. I mean, he might call, or I might send him a note, or he might send me a note. So there was very little interchange, but we had worked together for 5.5 years on all kinds of human service issues. So that wasn't a problem, but we were sort of flying on our own. I left the governor's office shortly after the council was started, so most of the last 2.5 years of the SHAP, I wasn't even around to know what happened. But several things I might have said have been said already. I'm trying to think of a few things that I remember about the governor that would portray his commitment to human services. You know, he was a very shy man and very unimposing. He lived very modestly, both before he became governor, and he really didn't like living in the governor's mansion. And he didn't come up for a long time. Stayed in Philadelphia, would come up, and finally they moved into the mansion. And to his great delight, we had a huge flood. And if you can remember the pictures of some people in a rowboat outside the governor's mansion coming up to get in the window of the second floor, well, that gave him a great excuse because it took months to get restore the mansion. So he found a very modest house over in Wormingsburg, right across the river, and never moved back. And I was thinking of Governor Wolf when we heard that, you know, because he's still living at home too, I understand. I mean, we had a lot of meetings in the mansion. There was a lot of public, but he never lived there again. He was an extremely passionate person. He was not a very good public speaker. He was a lousy campaigner. But he was bright as hell, and he knew he had ideas a minute. He drove us crazy at times. And in fact, one of the reasons I resigned, I was just exhausted after 5.5 years, you know, ideas. Or even his wife, Muriel, she was a very big advocate, especially for the aging. I mean, she might call me at 7 in the morning. What are we doing today about this? So this was a passionate family. I can think of a couple of instances that I think, for me, portrayed. He was engineer, but he was a businessman. He understood money, and he understood that the state, when he took it over, was in not good shape fiscally. Remember, he passed the state income tax, where I passed at the legislature. That was a big battle. And one of his main reasons for fighting so hard for an income tax was because most of the state money goes into human services. And to have that kind of money available, he felt was worth that battle. You may remember the right to education lawsuit and the settlement. We had a long discussion with advocates around a lawsuit against the state for special ed students. And at one point, we came, some of the folks in the Justice Department and myself, to a consent decree, we thought, but the Secretary of Education, Secretary of Budget were adamantly opposed because of the cost, or the cost estimates. So the governor asked the three of us, the two secretaries, myself, to come in for a meeting, and for an hour he listened to mostly them talk about why this didn't make sense. We could put more money into other things. We'll never get the legislature to approve it. And I gave our reasons for why to do it. And finally, somebody came in to, Governor, your Senator so-and-so has been waiting for his meeting outside there with you. So he stayed and he really listened to these arguments. And he got up, he said, oh yes, I got up and started out the door. And I think the two secretaries were looking pretty smug at the time. He says, turns around and he says, settle it. $50 million, that was what the cost was. But it sort of, and it was early on in administration, but it set a tone for that when he was interested in something to be done, whether it cost money or not, he was going to fight for it. One other last thing, I was thinking when Mark mentioned about the colonel from the state police, and I hadn't thought of this until you mentioned it, but we had a number of demonstrations that would be the capital for a variety of things against sometimes the governor, but most likely for raise some cause, whatever. And in my prior life, I had been an activist and had been arrested and jailed a number of times. And we learned from some of our troopers who were assigned to the governor's office that I was on the colonel's no-no list. And after a couple of demonstrations that things didn't go the way we thought they would be, people were not dealt with very well, the governor said to the Capitol Police and the state police worked together on that stuff, and he had everybody in the office. He says, "Now, how can we do this better?" And we had all these ideas, and he said, "All right, I want all those demonstrations coordinated through Terry's office." And I think the colonel resigned shortly after that one. But there's many, many, many more stories, but in a few minutes. I think that gives you a sense of what we felt about him. He was an unusual human being.
Thank you, Terry. I'd like to now go to the two LGBT community people on the panel. So I want to start with Sam Deetz.
Okay. Well, one of the questions that we were considering was how and what did you know or hear about Governor Schaap's LGBT initiatives and series of meetings leading up to the formation of the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities, and was it causing a certain amount of excitement and hopelessness in the LGBT community at that time? It's a good question, but I'd like to remind you, for those who may not know, back in those days, most gay men, at least that I know, and I suppose this applies to the women's community also, lived two lives. They had one life that they lived on weekends and holidays and so forth. That's when they met socially and interacted with people that they were comfortable with, where they didn't have to worry about how they said something or what pronoun they used and so forth. So then during the week, of course, it was going to work and acting like anybody else and monitoring how they spoke and who they spoke about and how they spoke of friendships. So I think the answer to that question is two different answers. The folks who were living that way and were accustomed to it and really a lot of them didn't see any hope, any chance of a change. So, I mean, imagine that. You're living in your own skin, and you know that everybody else thinks that you're sick or you're a criminal or you're a sinner or whatever the situation may be. So the people that really were excited were those of us who were somehow chosen by fate to be interested and felt that there could be a change. I fortunately was one of those. I came from a conservative environment and had a very long struggle with the conflicts that came my way. So yes, I was excited as could be. And for me and people like me, at that time, there were, after Stonewall and a lot of what Mark went over earlier, there were people who were becoming aware. What I did was I found out for myself. How did I know about the governor's executive orders, and how did I get involved? I made it my duty and my interest, my primary interest, to find out. So to kind of shorten things up a little bit, I went to Philadelphia. I learned that there were GAA meetings down there, and I went and attended several GAA meetings. At one of those meetings, the political director of that organization, I believe at that time, was Mark Segal. He had a double role. He was also in Gay Raiders, but served with the GAA, and I met him and I met some other people. And I said, how do I start a gay activists alliance in Northumberland, Pennsylvania? Well, I think he probably wanted to laugh, but instead I got a phone call in a couple of weeks, and Mark said, we'll come up and help you, and we made arrangements, and he came, I believe, on the train to Harrisburg, and I picked him and another friend by the name of Bill Way up at the station in Harrisburg. And I took them up to Northumberland, and we met with about 20-some men. And I had taken the time to make phone calls and invite people from the community. Some were women, but only men attended those first few meetings. But that's how I got involved. I found out pretty soon after I met people, Mark came up. I already had a group started within a couple months. We formed a governor's, when we heard about the governor's task force, I was attending those meetings every month, regularly. The room, the governor's conference room table, I was trying to think, it must have held, I'll bet you 30 or 40 people could have sat around that table. But till the end of those task force meetings, that table was crowded with chairs brought in, and then there were chairs behind that, and people standing all around the walls of that big room, because the excitement was growing. The activists that were here in the central part of the state were attending, as well as the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh people. Terry Delmuth was there, of course, at the head of the table, along with Barry Kahn, and I think another gentleman, another attorney was there. But it all felt so good. It made you, so there were two answers again, going back to that question. The people who believed in change were excited as could be, and what our duty was then was to spread that excitement and spread that belief, and that there would be change, and we did see growth, and that's the answer pretty much.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Marilyn, do you want to talk about your recollections?
When I first moved to Harrisburg in 1973, I searched and searched and searched, and I've slowly started to find the lesbian and gay community. Wasn't easy, but I discovered that there actually was a fairly socially active lesbian and gay community in Harrisburg. And it must have been in 1974 or early 75, a wonderful man from Philadelphia who had become a friend of mine, his name was Lee Robbins, decided that Harrisburg should have a hotline for lesbian and gay people. And he helped a bunch of people found the Gay Switchboard of Harrisburg. And I kept telling him I wasn't interested. Well, he kept telling me I was interested until I finally relented. And relenting meant becoming the director of the Gay Switchboard. So for several years, I served as the director of the Gay Switchboard of Harrisburg. Eventually, in probably late 1975, and I don't even remember how this happened, someone informed me that not only that the governor had issued an executive order and was forming the governor's council, because I was young and I was oblivious to that. Not only did they inform me that that had happened, but they had informed me that he was going to appoint me to this council. And needless to say, I was very, very proud. I was also very, very stunned. And I was also somewhat scared. And I was scared because I worked at the time for the state. I was a state employee, even though I was a community representative. And I had never come out at work. I had a limited amount of local experience with helping with some training and things like that with outside groups, but I certainly wasn't out publicly. I was not out with my parents, not my sisters, or I actually had an extended family, grandmother, aunts, and uncles, cousins here in the Harrisburg area, and I certainly was not out to them. So I had a decision to make, and it was very interesting. And after weighing everything, I decided to accept the appointment. For one thing, and it was just a fairly selfish reason, I decided that would force me to come out and take that weight off my own shoulders. And so the first thing I did was I went and told my boss that I had been appointed to the Governor's Council, and I told him what it was, and I just sat there with a smile on my face because I knew he couldn't fire me because the governor said so. So he was subdued, but he was fine. He understood that I would be going to meetings, et cetera, and he understood what it was about. Then I called my sisters, who were fine with it themselves, but my one sister said, "Don't tell our parents. They can't take it." So then I called my parents. No, I didn't. I'm sorry, I didn't call my parents. I went home to upstate New York and sat down at the kitchen table and told my parents. And although they were subdued and stunned, they were very supportive of me, and they were, for the rest of their lives, very supportive of me. So the final thing that I'd like to say about why I joined the Governor's Council was I couldn't wait to meet Barbara Giddings. She had been my idol ever since I saw her interviewed on the David Susskind show. And I was so nervous when I went to that first council meeting, not about the meeting whatsoever. I was so nervous I was going to meet Barbara Giddings. And the last time I saw Barbara several years ago in a Trader Joe's near Wilmington, Delaware, I reminded her of that and told her that she'd always been my idol, and she just rolled her eyes and she said, "Marilyn, you always say that to me." So I miss Barbara very much, as I know most of us do. Anyway, my actual experience with the council was fairly limited because in late 1977, I relocated to the Philadelphia area, and I decided it was time to concentrate on my career. So I did not participate in the council after that. But I do have some fond memories of the council, the people that I worked with and still love to this day, and some of the impacts. For one thing, I'm sure my coming out had some impact on my coworkers. I don't think they'd ever thought about gay people, didn't think of them on a day-to-day basis, as none of the culture did at that time. And they liked me, so how could they all of a sudden not like me? Because they knew me. And of course, that's always the most important thing with this whole issue is make people get to know you. And it changes them completely. So I think I had a good impact on my coworkers that way. There was one, that's a funny story, there was one division of the department that apparently was found it quite scandalous that I was lesbian, and they were gossiping about it and telling each other, and they were making copies of news articles about me and handing them out and things like this. And what they didn't realize was that one of the men who was a volunteer on the gay switchboard and a very good friend of mine worked there, and he told me everything they said and everything they did. So I found that pretty humorous. One of the things that I did when I was on the council was I attempted to deal with the State Workers Union, AFSCME, to see if we could encourage them to put a non-discrimination clause in their state employment contract. I was very naive at the time. Pennsylvania was a right-to-work state back then, so I hadn't joined the union. I was like young, and that's what I did. So when they found out I hadn't joined the union, they just booed me out of the room, and that was about the extent of my success with AFSCME. So my naivety there limited my effectiveness, but at least I had been able to bring the subject up in front of them, and I don't know how they eventually dealt with it, but hopefully, eventually someone got through to them, as I was unable to. And the last thing that being on the council did was it made me more active in the local community. I did a lot of community outreach. I spoke on radio, television. I was interviewed in newspapers. I did training. I talked to church groups, college groups, and so that was not absolutely on behalf of the council, but being out and open as I was, enabled me to be more public and serve, I think, our cause a little better. So in retrospect, I think the appointment to the council actually did more for me than I ever did for the council. But I will tell you, I think it's probably the proudest moment of my life when I was appointed. Thanks.
Before we turn to the representatives on the panel who are representing the agencies, various agencies on the council, I wanted to read just one thing from Tom Wilson Weinberg, who was not able to attend this evening, who was on the council. And he expresses his regret for not being here, but it's his birthday, and he had some other plans. But he did sent along a couple of stories, and one in particular I thought, since we already mentioned about state police, Colonel James Barger, he had a story that he wanted to share about that. And on January 20th, 1976, the State Police Committee, of which I was a member on the council, met with Commissioner James Barger. Colonel Barger agreed to let us meet with top-level state police officials for a 6-month period. Entrapment arrests were common all over the state at that time, especially at turnpike rest areas. In July of 1976, 5 men were arrested at rest area near Chambersburg. On October 25th, we asked to meet with lower-ranking state police officers. Colonel Barger said no. On December 14th, Barger informed us in a letter to Tony Sylvestri that, quote, "The department has not changed its opinion of gay people. We do not have time to have other officers meet with you. The department still has deep reservations about employing gay men and women." So it did take quite a bit of time, I think, for that agency in particular to come around. But we have other agencies that were a little bit more enlightened with us tonight. So I'd like to have Carol Rank talk about her experiences.
Thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to be here and also a privilege. We were asked to comment on what were some of the significant accomplishments of the council that basically affected public policy. I don't have one, I've got 4, and Tony kind of touched on some of them earlier in the presentation. Picture the mid-late 1980s, from the 70s, now we're kind of jumping. The Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare, now known as the Department of Human Services, another long time in coming event, was facing a new epidemic, and for some of you historians back then, you know that it was called GRID. And for those of you who are too young to remember that, it was called gay-related infectious disease. And it was a mystery. We came to know the epidemic later, a few months later, as HIV, AIDS, ARC. It had all kinds of names, and brought with it a lot of fear. The relationship that we developed with the council, specifically Tony, Randy Forrester, Jerry Brennan, resulted in us accomplishing several things as a statewide department whose myriad of services covered everything from mental health services to children and youth services, and you know the laundry list of things that the department does today and did back then, including some state-owned general hospitals that we no longer own, but at that time we had a few left. So we had a lot of fear, we had a lot of concern, and so we were looking for some resources, who to go to. The Department of Health didn't really have any structure or individuals that we could talk to or go to about this. So we were kind of hooked up through Art and other folks that were serving on the council. We were kind of hooked up with the council and asked them to help us. And as a result of that relationship, we were able to create the first statewide HIV/AIDS Advisory Committee. We created the first statewide agency public policy on HIV/AIDS. We created a public-private partnership with a major foundation to fund HIV-related education and to talk about within that education non-discrimination, which was very important. And we did that for all of the DPW-owned and operated programs, facilities, and we also included in that community-based funded programs. For example, some of the county children and youth agencies throughout the Commonwealth were also invited to participate. The other accomplishment was the special funding. Tony pointed out in his slide presentation the need for, obviously, money. We needed additional funding for what was then called the AZT grant. And you might ask, how in the heck did the Department of Public Welfare get the AZT grant? We didn't get the AZT grant. The Department of Health did, but the governor's office at that time said DPW has the infrastructure to pay providers like pharmacies, and even though it was only one drug, so we're going to house it in the Department of Public Welfare. And so we hurried up, scurried about, and created the Special Pharmaceutical Benefits Program. And some of you might ask, well, why in the heck did you call it that? Well, we didn't want to label it as the AZT program because of the discrimination that was being incurred, both in our facilities as well as in community programs, and you've heard a lot about that. The advisory committee was significant for the LGBT community because the only other model that we had to look at was the Governor's Council on Sexual Minorities, and we used the connections and networking that the council brought to us to create this statewide advisory committee that helped the department develop its policy. We had individuals who were from the gay and lesbian community. We had individuals who were infected with HIV, and it was a very rough time because a lot of the members that we had on the committee who were infected were dying within 6 to 18 months. So we had a lot of turnover, but it was great because this was the first committee of its kind in state government, and they did a fabulous job of working with us and leading us to develop what was a very cutting-edge HIV/AIDS policy that addressed education, prevention, various kinds of management, non-discrimination, resources. I was reminiscing with Tony a little bit ago that, you know, we had basically PERSAD in Pittsburgh. We had to look around the country for people to help us learn about the LGBT, but it wasn't called that community back then. And it was interesting because there were very few resources. The Gay Men's Health Crisis Center in New York City. There was I don't remember the name of it, there was a group in Wisconsin, which floored me. And we also used a group in the Castro District in San Francisco to help us understand and learn and be ready to lead our department down the proper path. Oh, I missed one other important person that was on the committee. We asked the Federal Office of Civil Rights to send a representative, and they did. We also had bipartisan representation from the Pennsylvania State House and Senate. So it was a very eclectic and very interesting group to staff from my position. At the time, we also had at least 4 employees who were infected working for us, and at least 3 individuals who were receiving services in one of our program settings. So we needed to address this rather quickly, and did so with the help of the council giving us the right connections to work with. The other issue was the money. And if it wasn't for some of the advocates from various parts of the state helping to get the extra money for the AZT grant and create the Special Pharmaceuticals Benefits Program, which is still, like Tony said, still running strong and is a model to this day. But we also went and asked for additional money to fund some housing situations for persons living with AIDS who were being discriminated against, who were put out in the street, who were sick, who needed a place to stay. And some of you from the eastern part of the state would remember Batak. It was a home in Mount Airy that we augmented with funds, as well as some other residential living places throughout the Commonwealth. So I think that our relationship with the council was a very good partnership where they helped shape public policy very directly through the contacts that they were able to give to us to work with.
Dolly?
My first job out of law school was as an assistant general counsel with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, the state agency which enforces the Pennsylvania non-discrimination statute, which to this day still unfortunately does not cover sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. Not for lack of trying, and I'll get to that in a moment. So PHRC was an obvious choice to have a representative on the council. And I was an attorney in the headquarters office, and I was selected to be the commission's representative. Or as many of my compatriots called me, the token straight. Hey, everybody's got to have one. And because of what I was doing as a state employee, I also wound up chairing the Government Employees Subcommittee. And one of the more interesting arguments that was going on one day in the committee, and I really do not remember the exact subject of the argument, and you have to understand this group was the most, and still is, the most passionate, well-informed group of people you would ever have the pleasure of working with, the most committed, and an absolute joy to be working with, because everybody, even at the time when the arguments were at their most, how shall I put it, intense, there was a respect because everybody had the common goal of trying to make things better, to bring things along so that life for everybody was going to be improved, and the common goal of overcoming the rampant discrimination that was going on would be achieved. So you can imagine that the argument was hot and furious, and had been going on for about 20 minutes, and finally they looked at me and said, "Okay, Dolly, what do you think?" And I said, "I don't know, I could go either way." 5 minutes later, when I picked everybody up off the floor, including myself, I might add, I said, "Okay, time for a break," and then we went back to the discussion after we had our little break. But this was definitely the most engaged group of people you could ever want to work with. The commission at that time had jurisdiction over contract compliance. So although we didn't have jurisdiction over sexual orientation, there were some areas where, because of the governor's executive order, we could have some influence, as was brought out with the contracts. And we also, in the early stages of when I was with the commission, wound up having jurisdiction over handicap and disability. And as AIDS then started to become an issue and became a recognized, under the law, area of disability, that also gave the commission a way of dealing with the discrimination that was occurring. You know, if you can't raise the bridge, lower the river. If you can't go in the front door, you go in the back door. I left the commission for other jobs in May of 1978, but in August of 1983, I was back again, this time as chief counsel. And as was mentioned before, both by Dr. Levine and Ted Martin, there has been a lot of attempts to bring Pennsylvania into at least the 20th century, if not the 21st, and get the statute amended, get Pennsylvania to, having started with this wonderful executive order, having led everybody to play catch-up and amend our state non-discrimination law. And trust me, it was not for lack of PHRC's trying. We underwent, at least while I was chief counsel, 3 of that glorious institution called sunset reviews. For those of you who don't know what that wonderful piece of torture is, the sunset review started off as the well-intentioned concept of state agencies should not exist in perpetuity, but rather should be re-examined to make sure that they were fulfilling their goal, and if necessary, statutes should be rewritten so that these agencies would be useful, and if they wouldn't continue to be useful, you would sunset them. They would ride off into the sunset, never to be heard from again. Obviously, the goal of eradicating discrimination had not been achieved, so we managed to continue to exist. We should only achieve the goal. You're in a situation where 3 of them, because they thought that we were such a wonderful agency, we needed to have it more often than other agencies. We kept trying to have the protected class of sexual orientation, that was 1985, sexual orientation, gender identity, and then the third time around, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, included under our act. That never made it out of the very first subcommittee review. I won't even mention which subcommittee it was. The names of the guilty are protected. But it wasn't for lack of PHRC trying to cover as many of those who desperately needed covering as possible. However, you did have the expanded area of the disability issues coming to fore, and we were able to go forward with trying to provide protection against discrimination, because you also had, under the disability section, perceived handicap and disability, and since you were having the rather unfortunate public reaction of if you were gay, you automatically were perceived as having HIV, and therefore perception of a disability, that fell under our act. As part of what we were doing, and I was doing a lot of it myself, we did a lot of training, both state agencies, Carol can tell you that. I showed up on your doorstep. Roadshow, the traveling roadshow. We did a lot with private organizations, with the Bureau of Professional Occupational Affairs, I can tell you with two of their attorneys, we went to a lot of funeral directors associations who were terrified of dealing with individuals who, whether they had died of AIDS, whether they were suspected of being gay and therefore were presumed to be infected, and all of the various misperceptions that went along with this and what was going on. We were all around the state trying to bring the last part of an individual's life, which is death, into some sort of order and remove the discrimination at that point. The types of education that went on, be it at hospitals, be it at any kind of facility where there was terror of what do we do with individuals who had mental disabilities, and then you're in nursing homes, and how do we deal with people who may be sexually active but do not necessarily have the mental capacity to understand what to do, and educating people on the fact that you have plans in place for people, clients, patients who have STDs. You have situations where you already have policies. You can use them. And the idea that you already have ways of handling situations in place, and this is something that will fit into existing situations that you know how to deal with, tremendously reduced people's concerns and terror because it brought it from the unknown into the known. The more that people realized they were dealing with something that was familiar, the same way as they realized that the people that they were dealing with, be they gay, lesbian, transgender, questioning, bisexual, were people that they were dealing with that they knew as colleagues before they knew of their sexual orientation. And once they were dealing with familiar people or familiar situations, it lessened their fear, their terror, their desire to push off and treat as other. And that kind of education was essential. And the other thing that happened was when AIDS went from being a death sentence to something that could be managed, people began to relax. But in dealing with the council, in dealing with the support that we gave each other, whether it was the different state agencies in knowing that you were not alone, that there were other people, and God bless Art, who made sure that he linked up every known resource in the Commonwealth, whether officially in the governor's jurisdiction or not. That is what made this an effective council, because you had the resources and you had the people to rely on.
Let's hear now from Art Duprat.
Crowd here. I'm going to answer some questions that were raised here. Questions about what happened with the AFSCME contract. Questions about what happened with contracting, because although Governor Wolf signed an executive order this past week on contracting with a non-discrimination clause, the wording in the executive order done in 1978 by Governor Shapp also had that. And I'm going to talk about some things that happened in the 2 years from 1976 to 1978, the last 2 years of Governor Shapp's administration, that might be instructive for the future, that might be instructive for learning what could be done to have the policies that are now coming out from Governor Wolf survive and prosper in a more hostile environment that might occur in the future. Now, I was working in 1976 in EEO and writing policies in the Governor's Office of Administration. And one day, this young man came into my office. My boss had called me, the Secretary of Administration, said, there's this guy who wants to talk to you. And the guy was Barry Kahn. Barry Kahn was so critical to the beginning of what happened with the Council for Sexual Minorities. Assistant Attorney General in the Governor's office. The Attorney General at that point was under the Governor's jurisdiction, not a separate office. He came into my office, sat down, and said, we're about to have Governor Shapp sign an executive order creating a Council for Sexual Minorities. He said, you're involved with writing EEO policy in the state. You're involved with a lot of other things with human resources. We have 2 years to embed the concept of non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation so that it lasts no matter who the next governor might be. And he said one other thing, which was probably one of the better days of my life. He said, I'd like you to meet Tony Sylvestri, and set up a meeting the next day for me to sit down with Tony and to talk about what we could do. Let me tell you, this was an amazing time. I sit here today, I had difficulty coming here, knowing that Barbara Giddings wouldn't be with us. Barry Kahn on August 3rd of 1987 passed away. Walter Lear, gone. It's a difficult time to think about the past and to try to put this all together. Randy Forrester, who was just so important in putting things together. But what we were able to do then was, let me tell you, land-breaking. It was the first anywhere, and maybe the first thing like it, and the last thing like it ever to have happened. The first thing we did in my office was to revise the state's EEO policy, requiring that every state agency, not just in an executive order, that every state agency have a policy of non-discrimination on the basis of sexual, at that point, sexual preference. 2 years later, it was orientation. 27 agencies did it, 3 did not. I think some of us here could probably guess the ones who didn't. They were State Police, the Game Commission, and the Fish Commission, who refused. I didn't even know the concept of NRA at the time, but I do now. But 27 did. And not only that, we began to see state agencies take complaints from employees about being discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation. And it became part of a process where we resolved those complaints. Some of them would come to Tony Sylvestri, some of them would come to the agency equal opportunity staff. But we were able to solve issues that were happening in the workplace. Barry Kahn came back to me before he left state government, and he said, we need to do more before Governor Shapp leaves office. Now, Uncle Milt might have been in Florida campaigning, but we were there working. And I sat down with Tony Sylvestri and a number of the other wonderful people here like Dolly, and we put together a revised executive order. Let me read one sentence from the executive order, which goes much farther than what Governor Wolf has put out now, and should send a message for what the current administration should be doing. There should be no discrimination of any Commonwealth Department, board, or commission on the basis of, at that point, sexual or affectional orientation. Of course, that's changed. In any matter of hiring, employment, housing, credit, contracting, provision of state agency services, or any other matter. Now, we've taken the first two steps this past week. We've dealt with contracting and we've dealt with employment, but we haven't dealt with two important things. Those things are services that state government provides. It is so important that every state agency have non-discrimination clauses in their services. And the second is what you see here, the activists, the brilliant people that put this council together, the original gay task force, the group that was out there zapping before that. Here I was, a member of a bureaucratic staff, and some of the others here were too, unfamiliar with what was going on in the world. We were educated by the activists on what was needed. I read the current executive orders from Governor Wolf, and they talk about the Office of Administration administering the policy on equal employment, and the Department of General Services administering the policy on contracts. Someone needs to set up something that connects those two agencies with those who are affected by discrimination, educates, orients, and enlightens those staffs. But I'm going to get off my soapbox. In Governor Schaap's last year, we rewrote the executive order, and we went to the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania in 1978 and got an Attorney General's opinion that sexual orientation included transgender and transsexual. That decision was the first one anywhere that I have heard of anywhere in America. That was done in 1978, 38 years before what we see now. And it wasn't until 2003 that Governor Rendell finally put out wording that was specific on that community. We also did a couple of other things. One of the most important that very few people actually realize, at that point in time, the state colleges were under the governor's jurisdiction. That didn't change until 1973. What we did is we got every one of the 14 state colleges and universities to have non-discrimination clauses, not only for their employees, but for their students as well. And when the state system of higher education became independent from the governor, those policies remained. They were embedded. This was the first state system anywhere in America that had protections on the basis of sexual orientation for their students. And this was done in 1978. This was amazing what was happening with Governor Schaap. Just totally, totally amazing. The final steps that we took before Governor Schaap left office were to turn to the unions. And we turned to state unions to try to get wording embedded in union contracts that would keep the non-discrimination clause no matter who the next governor was. The race for governor at that time was going on. Dick Thornburg was running against Bob Casey. neither one of them was a champion of gay rights, although both of them said very little negatively as well. We were able to get 3 state unions, PNA, the nurses, yes, it certainly was, APSCUF, the college professors, and PSSU, social workers, to have that wording in their contracts. AFSCME, no. We were not able to get AFSCME. Jerry McEntee, who had moved to DC at that point, who at that point was also part of making sure that members of the LGBT community couldn't march in St. Patrick's Day parades, was unwilling to go along with it. Governor Shapp left office. Some of you know what happened. Ethel Allen, the Secretary of State, a wonderful woman, at 50 years old, African American from Philadelphia, went to Governor Thornburg. It's in the book. You have to read Mark's book. And Mark was talking to Ethel Allen at the time. Those of us in the state were as well. I said, Ethel, don't do this. But she did it. Ethel Allen went to Dick Thornburg and said, and gave him a pile of 8 executive proclamations to sign one day. And number 7 on that list of 8 was a statewide Gay Pride Week in Pennsylvania. Governor Thornburg signed all 8. Within 12 hours, the legislature had raised the dome of the Capitol. And not only had they raised the dome, there was a vote the next day, 173 to 12, I can tell you all 12 were from the Philadelphia area, that against the, we sat down trying to figure out what to do. We convinced, and I think Mark knows this, we convinced Governor Thornburg, don't do anything stupid. Put out an executive proclamation for a family pride week. Little did he know that gay people also have families. But, and he did that. We then, in my office, in the Office of Administration, and Mark and others may not know this, went through 2 months of pressure to revoke the executive order on the Council for Sexual Minorities. We were under extreme pressure to do it. The argument that we made to keep the council, and it remained for the entire Thornburg administration, was that by removing it would create more problem than by keeping it. It was more difficult to work from that time on, but over the next 2 years, amazing things continued to happen. We went to Dick Thornburg and we said, all of our union contracts should be consistent. They'll be easier to administer. He said, do it, because he was a good administrator. One after another, the liquor store clerks, wording, protecting liquor store clerks for sexual orientation, the game conservation officers, and finally, after, when is it that the employer has to push a union to protect its own employees? Finally, AFSCME relented. And then, and at the same time, we used the same concept of consistency among all policies to get the Pennsylvania State Police, the Game Commission, and the Fish Commission to have non-discrimination clauses in their state policies. So the things that happened in the final 2 years of the Schaap administration tell us a story. They tell us that if people inside take the spirit that was there from activists on the outside and move with that spirit to embed it in policies that have a longer life, that you can survive a Governor Thornburg, you can survive a President Cruz, you can survive if you think through how policies actually are implemented and last. I don't want to take any more time, but I would say that under Bob Casey and under Tom Ridge, we were able to increasingly get money for the HIV/AIDS training effort, and Pennsylvania became the leader in the nation in terms of educating state employees. And by that, I don't mean an hour session. I mean that we would go to every single prison in the state and spend 3 days at that prison. In other states, in Ohio and in Missouri, corrections officers were refusing to work with inmates who are HIV positive. We went, we had staff from the University of Pittsburgh's medical school, we had activists from Philadelphia and from Allentown. We were able to send a message of not only non-discrimination, but universal precautions, all the things that were needed to make an organization work in a time of stress. We would not have been able to do that in the Casey and Ridge administrations if Governor Schaap had not laid the groundwork and changed the environment in state government to be an open place where these things could be discussed. Let's recall that for the entire 8 years of President Reagan's administration, he never said the word AIDS. But we were able to talk about those things in Pennsylvania because of Governor Schaap. 2003 brought us a great move from Governor Rendell, where he was changed the wording of the policy to say gender, identity, and expression. And then, amazingly, in 2009, under Governor Rendell, the state of Pennsylvania moved to cover same-sex partners of state employees for all state benefits, including their children, a recognition that there is a gay family. Governor Corbett left these things alone, and now we have the spirit of a governor who is willing to take this challenge once again. We have so much to learn from what happened in the Schaap administration, so much to learn from the leadership that was provided by Tony Sylvestri, so much to learn by the enthusiasm and the will and the spirit of the Mark Segal and others who pushed all of this to happen in the first place. This has been a wonderful 40 years. I'm proud to be here today.
I apologize, we're running a little bit late on the program, but we do have Jay Snyder to hear from yet, so let's...
I'll be as brief as I can be. I suspect another reason that Art had struggles about being here today is because it's his birthday today. So happy birthday, Art.
Jay and I are getting together for a birthday party on Friday, and I'm looking forward to it. Jay is the first person I met in state government. I walked into my first office coming out of grad school at Penn State, and from that day on, he's had my back.
When you talk about raising the dome of the Capitol, that's where our office was. It was up in the dome. The supports for the chandeliers in the State House ran right through our office. It was originally not intended to be an office. It was a storage closet, but that's where we ended up. And we came out of the closet eventually, right? I suspect that Colonel Barger was wrong when he slammed his hand down on the governor's desk and said, "I won't have any gay troopers." I suspect he already had some besides Mark. But Governor Shapp was some other things too. He was a poet. Some of us have his volumes of poetry. And one of his other executive orders, he couldn't do away with the death penalty in Pennsylvania, but right before he left office, the night before, he issued one of those executive orders that dismantled the electric chair up at Rockville. So he never stopped until the day he left office. The questions that Barry gave us to review or to possibly address as agency representatives to the Governor's Council were things like, what was your initial reaction to the idea of serving on the council? Well, mine was, oh, damn, another job that has nothing to do with what I do. I've got to go sit in meetings all day. But I found out soon enough that this was part of my education process, because I found out that sexual minorities was a lot more than just gay men and lesbian women. There was a lot more to that population, and I never stopped learning those lessons. I don't think my attitudes toward people that are gay had started to change a long time before I got on to the Governor's Task Force. I'd been a chaperone with some youth groups and taking them to a weekend in New York City and staying sleeping bags on the floor of a church in Greenwich Village, and seeing the people that Sam was talking about that can be themselves when they go to the village, when they could, it was almost like a parade on Saturdays and Sundays of people that were free of those shackles of having to live the roles that they had in their community, in their jobs in government or banking or sales or whatever. And then they would go to Greenwich Village where they could be themselves and be free for a weekend or two every once in a while. And it was really obvious that that's exactly what was happening. One of the other questions that, some of the things that you learned, I learned about the horror of what was called aversion therapy at that time. That's something I haven't heard since then, and I'm delighted that nobody's talking about it, because maybe that's not happening anymore. When I went on into my own later career in tennis, it took a while, but we created a LGBT employees group in the U.S. Tennis Association. It's not going to surprise you to know that among the population of men and women athletes, there are gays and lesbians, and they're certainly present on the tennis tour. They always have been. See if I have some of my other notes that things occurred to me. I think that one of the big things that the Governor's Task Force did back in the 70s was it raised an issue to the public that really wasn't being raised in Pennsylvania. Maybe it was in some pockets, certainly was in Philadelphia, but Mark and Tony scared a lot of people in government. Mark shaking his head, yes. They really did. But that shakeup brought progress. And I think right now, gay issues are almost mainstream. Kids kind of accept that. That generation that's growing up now is much more accepting of people that are transgender, people that are gay, people that are lesbians, the LGBT community. Those issues are being discussed in schools. And so there's not that urgency that there was back in the 70s. I think we need more Marks and Tonys. I think we need those people now to step up and shake some folks in government up, not just in North Carolina and Mississippi, where they're having their own issues right now. But when Art was talking about how fast the legislature worked here, they worked a lot faster than they did in North Carolina. People are talking about how fast it just happened in North Carolina. Well, the Pennsylvania legislature still needs somebody to grab them by the collar and shake them up. And I do have to admit, when Art said President Cruz, I had chills. It just, that just scared me. I think that I had a lot more notes, things that I was going to talk about from back in the 70s and my memories, but I also am very well aware of, I don't know how long you have the hall rented, so we've got to keep things moving. So that it was history making. 1976 wasn't just the bicentennial. It was a lot of other monumental things that happened in state government, and we have not only Governor Schaap, but people at this table and others, and certainly Tony and Mark to thank. And they've been part of my education, that's for sure. So, thank you.
I think we'll have the panel go sit in the audience, and the second panel come up. We're going to do this pretty briefly. We have already heard from Dr. Levine and Ted Martin, so I want to focus a little bit more on Jason providing us with some comments, since Jason kind of represents the future, as was just mentioned, about young people. So let me introduce Jason. He's the founding executive director of the Pennsylvania Youth Congress. He has been a leader in the LGBTQ movement for 7 years. Jason's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and is currently a law student at the University of Pittsburgh. He's won numerous awards and accolades for his LGBT activism and was selected by the White House in 2012 to participate in the first LGBT Emerging Leaders Program. So I'd like to get Jason the chance to talk first, and then if Dr. Levine and Ted have anything to add at that point, we'll do that. And we're going to try to wrap this up in about 10 minutes.
Thank you. First, I just want to say how humbled I am to be here tonight with you all in walking in the footsteps of the giants before us. As a fifth-generation Pennsylvanian, I don't know if I could be here without them. Last year at our annual state conference, the Pennsylvania Youth Action Conference, we focused on rural LGBT youth issues, and we honored the founders of the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus, and many of them are here tonight and were involved in the founding of the council. In accepting the award, Joe Burns said how much that he loved us and called us his grandchildren. And to respond to that, we love you, and you are our grandparents, so thank you for making today where we are possible. And also to continue the tradition, it's my birthday today, so I would not rather be anywhere else than right here. So in terms of one of the questions that we were asked in terms of what is ahead in future in policy, equality across the board will be with us shortly. The arc for justice is inevitable, that we will secure all of the policy wins. And that's something I truly believe that we are just actors right now helping realize that goal. But I speak for many, and certainly young folks, when we say we're not just fighting for equality, we're fighting for justice, we're fighting for liberation. And so in that spirit, all of the wins that we have ahead of us, I think we really need to make sure are done in a righteous way that includes all voices at the table. So just to talk a little bit about the policy issues ahead. So at PYC, we work particularly on safer schools policies and issues. So that includes dealing with issues in bullying and harassment and intimidation and violence within our schools. I think we're going to see a lot more successes through using Title IX in ensuring students have equal access and equal treatment under the law for certainly public schools. We're going to be seeing a lot more trans student policies arise, and we're on the ground throughout the Commonwealth in many districts helping support local advocates in that effort. Another area, certainly, we just held this year's Pennsylvania Youth Action Conference last weekend, and Dr. Levine was one of our featured speakers. And this year we focused on anti-LGBTQ violence. So we focused on community and state violence against LGBTQ Pennsylvanians with a specific focus on uplifting the experiences of trans women of color. And so I think we're going to see a lot more efforts to improve the police department's interactions with trans individuals and making sure we have justice for those who have been harmed by violence. In Philadelphia, we recently had Directive 152, where police have to respect the trans individuals in their engagements with them. And I think that, we need those policies everywhere, and we need to have more efficient criminal justice systems that provide justice for LGBT Pennsylvanians. And certainly public policy approaches that really support LGBT people, as we've heard, in providing services, whether that's homeless shelter policies, public health, school issues, and social and education programs. So all extensions of state government, we're going to see more integrated approaches. But just to start to wrap up, because we're left short on time, getting toward what we mean when we say what liberation looks like in the future of LGBT Pennsylvania work. We must center those who are most disenfranchised and marginalized in the systems of oppression at the forefront when we address policy, when we set the agenda, when we articulate and execute the agenda. So that means people of color, that means trans people of all backgrounds, the young folks, the elders, have the microphone or are at the front helping determine what happens. That means in the spirit, that means in all sorts of aspects of this advocacy. That we are all together as one voice. And I think that's something that the council was really intentful for. So when I was looking at all of the records, I firmly believe we have to know our history to know our future. So I would go to the archives and I would look up all the minutes and see all of the advocacy you've done, which is so incredible. And how to negotiate, making sure there's rural representation, making sure that all voices are at the table. And I say this, thinking about how we make sure liberation work is at the forefront and representation is at the forefront. I was very proud to stand last week with Governor Wolf's signing of the executive orders. But one thing I think we have to make sure that we keep in check is that, of the representatives there, who was at the table. And so while we had incredible diversity across the state, there wasn't necessarily any LGBT community leaders of color there. And so we want to make sure that we are really making all aspects of state government advocacy a platform for all Pennsylvanians to engage with. So the Council 2.0, as my last point, we've been working very much over the past 6 months to make sure we have an inspired next generation of getting together state conversations. And so we, as PYC, have helped coordinate the LGBTQ Pennsylvania Steering Committee. And we had our first meeting in Pittsburgh in January, and it's comprised of over 20 executive directors of LGBT organizations all throughout the Commonwealth. And we'll be working together in many of the ways that the council did to collaborate, to connect, to know each other, provide the relationships so we can have absolute efficiency in the state agenda. And so we're deeply inspired and rooted in this work with you, and I'm so excited to take the next steps to make sure that this movement moves forward and you are honored and we honor each other by making sure we're successful and we have the righteous wins. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a few brief comments. So it was absolutely fascinating to hear about the council and the work that you did and the policy work that you did. And so I am trying to absorb this like a sponge. I could see you looking at me, asking me to take up some of the mantle of what you've done. So we will be working within the Wolf administration. The executive orders was just the beginning. So we'll be working on policies in terms terms of healthcare disparities for LGBT individuals, other policy work, working with other agencies, Department of Human Services, Department of Corrections, and other agencies on all of the issues that you had faced in the 70s, which, to be honest with you, many of them we're still facing now, almost 40 years later. So it's humbling to hear about the work that you have done, and we will keep the fight going. Thank you.
So I can just really add, I think one of the things that was most gratifying to hear was talking about the intransigence that you faced in the beginning. You know, when you talked about the state police, and one thing I can say to you is that 6 years ago, when we changed the driver's marker, the gender markers on driver's license, our top ally in that effort was the state police, the Bureau of State Police, who came forward, who worked with us, and made sure that policy happened very quickly. So obviously your work has paid off, and obviously they were there right away. And I think that is a remarkable thing. What I can say to Pennsylvanians and what I can say to Pennsylvania's LGBT citizens is that, you know, the work of non-discrimination, the work of making sure everyone is equal is ongoing. And it is ongoing because it is a constant conversation. Last year alone, we arranged for nearly 4,000 people to visit their legislators. 4,000 people to visit their legislators, to ask about issues, to talk about issues, to introduce the LGBT community. You know, I no longer hear legislators say things to me like, there are no gay people in my district, or I never hear from gay people in my district. And that's because of you, and that's because of many of the meetings that all of you here in this audience have taken. These people work for you, you pay them. And I think until we keep this conversation moving forward, until we keep the pressure on the legislature, and that goes for all elected officials across Pennsylvania, things, you know, will change over time, but the pressure you continue helps to move those things forward and helps to keep moving that issue forward. You know, it is tremendous that we have some leaders that are really outstanding on these issues. But I can guarantee you that every leader of the legislature knows about LGBT issues, that every leader of the legislature has talked about non-discrimination, that every member of the leadership and their staffs are hearing about these issues. And so my suggestion to everyone, and the goal and the mission of Equality Pennsylvania will always be to bring the LGBT community to those that govern, that those that sit across the street, that those that make policy. We work with the Department of Health, we work with the policy office, and we're there crafting. You know, I'm happy to say we had a little bit of a hand in some executive order draft language. So I think that, you know, that is all work that is important, and we understand the policy work, and so we will continue doing that. And we will continue moving that forward. But you need to also, we all need to talk to legislators. And I truly hope there are a few people out there who consider running for office. I truly hope that. And that's the one thing I will always leave with this audience. So please, you make my life easier and our lives easier. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, panelists. We're going to go into a Q&A session. I think because of the late time, maybe we'll just invite you to come up to the reception and ask your questions of any of the panelists at that time. I want to quickly do a thank you to Jim Vaughn from the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission and his talented staff who made this event and the exhibit possible, including David Dunn, Howard Pullman, Lauren Bennett, Kyle Weaver, Michelle Ensminger, Alan Byler, Judy Engling, Mary Jane Miller, Ashley Wolf, Jenny Ashton, Sherry Trimble, Linda Powell, Danielle Perdue, Jennifer Gleim, Carol Buck, Troy Bixler, Jonathan Treffler, Nelson Ortiz, and Don Giles. Takes a village. Please also thank our other event co-sponsors, including the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania, Equality PA and Pennsylvania Youth Congress, and the Philadelphia Gay News. Finally, I'd like to recognize have all the former council members stand, along with the ones that were in the audience tonight, including Joe Burns, Mary Nancaro, and Sylvia Waters, and any of the other members that are here that I'm not aware of. Anthem, stand. As you heard, they did a remarkable job and remarkable accomplishments Please join us now for the reception up on the second floor mezzanine and see the new exhibit. Thank you for attending.